Let's get started. My name is Amanda Fuller, and I'm the Executive Symposium Editor with the Utah Law Review. And I would like to welcome you all to the second day of our 2021 Meera E Teitelbaum Law Review Symposium, Include Their Stories, Rethinking, Reimagining, and Reshaping Legal Education. The goal of today's panels is to pick up where we left off yesterday with our fantastic keynote speaker, Dean Danielle Conway, and discuss the incorporation of DEI into the legal curriculum. So we will have an opening address from Dr. Meera E. She is the Honorable Vaino Spencer Professor of Law, Director of the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, and Professor of Law at Southwestern Law at the American Bar Foundation. Her research merges jurisprudence with empirical methods to interrogate institutional diversity, affirmative action, and racial representation. Dr. Deo's book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, examines how the intersection of race and gender affects faculty experiences. She has received support from the National Science Foundation, Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship, Access Lex, Wolters Kluwer, and others. Dr. Deo is a member of the American Law Institute. So without further ado, I will turn the time over to Dr. Deo.
Well, good morning, everyone from California. I am thrilled to be here with you all today, and I want to start by thanking the organizers of these events for inviting me to share some of my original empirical research with you. I will also offer happy Diwali wishes, as this is the 5th day of this Hindu holiday, so I'm especially pleased to be here with you all. I have been asked to offer some opening remarks to set the stage for the day ahead with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in legal education. I'm presenting findings from a few different sources. I'll share national, longitudinal, quantitative data on law students collected through the Law School Survey of Student Engagement. I'm also presenting findings from my book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, published in 2019 by Stanford University Press. And this past year, I have also been collecting new data from law faculty on challenges due to COVID-19. So I'll share some findings from the pandemic effects on legal academia study as well. So here's a brief outline of what I'm hoping to cover in my 20 minutes or so of presentation time. I'll share some baseline data from both LESI and Unequal Profession, revealing particular challenges that we knew from before the pandemic related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then I'll share new data about how inequities have been heightened due to COVID-19, both for law students as well as for law faculty. And then I'll end with solutions. If we have time for a brief discussion, even better. Before we get to the data, why does diversity matter? Does it matter at all? Well, we know from a wealth of research in a number of different academic disciplines that exposure to diversity improves students' critical thinking, it increases overall satisfaction, and it enhances leadership skills. When we have diversity, not just among students who are sitting together in a classroom, but even among those who are at the podium, in the front of the classroom, facilitating conversations, leading discussions, obviously, opportunities for exposure to new ideas increase even further. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, or LESI. LESI conducts an annual survey in partnership with participating law schools. We ask on our survey about everything from time usage to the quality and frequency of interactions with faculty and staff and classmates. And then we publish blog posts and formal reports and work with individual schools as well as partner scholars and key players in legal education to work to document challenges in legal education as well as influence trends for improving legal education overall. I want to spend just a moment this morning first on our 2020 annual report, which I somewhat provocatively titled Diversity and Exclusion. We found significant differences in how diversity efforts on campus are perceived by students based on their privilege, not just based on race and ethnicity, but also gender, first-gen status, sexual orientation, debt level, and in other ways. It turns out that privileged students are relatively satisfied with diversity efforts on campus, but more vulnerable students see these efforts as falling short. For instance, while roughly 1/3 of white students support racial and ethnic diversity on campus, they see their schools as doing very much to support those efforts, 1/4 of Black students believe their schools are doing very little in this regard. A full third of first-gen students and 38% of students who owe more than $200,000 in educational debt report that they do not feel valued by their law schools. And 1 out of every 5 students who are Black, Latinx, and Native American, along with 32% of students whose parents did not finish high school, note that they do not feel comfortable being myself at this institution, compared to just 12% of all white students. So this is the baseline for law student diversity before COVID-19. What about law faculty? My book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, provides a similar baseline for understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the law faculty context before COVID-19. For this project, I collected quantitative and qualitative data from almost 100 law professors around the US with a focus on race times gender challenges. These are the compound effects facing women of color based on the interaction between their race and gender. That project revealed a number of barriers that are especially salient today, not only for women of color, but for other vulnerable populations. Here are a few of the relevant findings that are going to come up again and again. Women from all backgrounds report carrying extra service burdens. Many women of color are particularly overloaded with student obligations because students tend to see these professors as more available, more accessible, more responsive to student needs. Third, the vast majority of women of color in my previous project worried that extra service and student work kept them from focusing on the research that tends to be most valued at many institutions. And finally, women from all backgrounds are more likely to be the default parent at home, responsible for carrying the mental load, providing emotional labor, and even the basics of hands-on child rearing. So now that we know some of the barriers facing law students of color and women of color law professors from before the pandemic, we can turn to consider the ways in which they have been exacerbated due to the pandemic. Here, I'll share some findings from the Leslie report we released just 10 days ago, the COVID crisis in legal education, as well as data from my ongoing study, Pandemic Effects on Legal Academia. Our report reveals that students struggled to meet even just their basic needs. 63% worried about the ability for them to pay their bills. 29% were concerned about eviction and housing loss. And unfathomable to me, 43% of our law students faced food insecurity, including over 50% of all students of color. This goes, of course, beyond race and ethnicity to other vulnerable populations among law students. 1 in 5 first-gen students said that COVID interfered very much with their ability to pay for law school and related living expenses, compared to only 11% of students who have at least one parent with a college degree. Debt burdens also correlate. Only 10% of students who expect to graduate debt-free noted that COVID-19 interfered quite a bit or very much with their ability to pay for law school and living expenses, compared to 26% of those owing up to $100,000 and a whopping 40% of those with over $100,000 in loans. Given student struggles regarding food, housing, and financial security, plus a declining quality of life, it is not surprising that the vast majority of students in the Leslie survey noted depression and anxiety interfered with their daily functioning. Both of these findings, as you can see, have marked gender effects. Unsurprisingly, academic success took a big hit due to COVID-19, especially for students of color, as well as for women students. A full 79% of students shared that COVID-19 interfered with their ability to succeed as a student. As a student, 3/4 of all men were affected, as well as 82% of women. In addition to gender disparities, there are racial disparities. 18% of whites noted very much decline in their academic success, compared to a full quarter of students of color. Remarkably, in spite of all of these challenges, 78% of law students in 2021 rated their entire educational experience as good or excellent, likely due to the significant support they received from faculty. A full 93% of students appreciated that their professors showed care and concern for students. 72% reported positive relationships with professors, showing relative consistency with past years. But of course, that comes at a cost for faculty, especially women professors, and particularly those from vulnerable populations, including women of color, untenured faculty, and caregivers. So I'll turn then to think about these challenges using data from my Pandemic Effects on Legal Academia project. Faculty are doing all they can to support students, but they're not always getting the support they need. This means that some faculty members feel like they have become therapists in addition to professors. This is a refrain I heard often in our interviews. Many participants had to triage, focusing just on the immediate things that needed to get done, whether that was teaching for faculty members, often administrative work for leaders. And I'll note here that the PILA survey data show that over a quarter of law professors have taken up to a 15% salary reduction since the start of the pandemic. Over 1/3 are working with decreased or eliminated research funds or stipends, no sabbaticals, RAs, TAs, or pay for overload teaching. And even just doing the basics has been a struggle. One assistant professor in her first year of teaching, juggling a toddler at home, told me that she's pulling 2 all-nighters every week just to prep for class. She is incredibly anxious about her lack of scholarly productivity, which brings us to the next point. Almost every professor with whom I've spoken has told me they've had very little time to devote to scholarship in the past year. Multiple professors didn't write at all. Some couldn't get in the right headspace, given that they were preoccupied by the pandemic, Black Lives Matter protests, election stress, the Capitol takeover, and the resumption of mass shootings, especially those targeting Asian Americans. Others were overwhelmed with other priorities that literally took time away from their usual summer writing routine. Those who did manage to get work done had to be creative in their juggling, often giving up sleep so that they could work. Again, this is a pervasive pattern in the data. Everybody seems to be sleeping less now than pre-COVID. Junior scholars especially worried about how their lack of productivity would impact promotion, tenure, or other opportunities for advancement, knowing how much their institutions value scholarship and worrying about their lack of productivity. And almost everybody with whom I spoke shared that they had increased levels of stress, pressure, and anxiety, again, mirroring what we have seen in the student context as well. So I want to pause just a moment to highlight this in particular, because it's something that we really don't talk about much in legal academia, in the legal profession, even not much with regard to legal education, and that is mental health. Every single participant in the PILA study had elevated stress levels compared to just a year prior. Professors are lonely. They are hitting their limits. They are feeling both the psychological and even the physiological effects of that stress. Many professors lost personal time along with personal space, with consequences on their physical health as well as their mental health. People shared with me that they were going through marital troubles, that they had infertility issues, that they were worried about extended family members as well. And a lot of parents especially had intense guilt. Many of them felt like they could not be the kind of parent that they saw themselves as pre-pandemic. They couldn't be present. They heard themselves saying no a lot. They felt like they had a significant quantity of time, but not great quality of time with their families. And one of the most awful things that I noticed as a researcher is how participants had already normalized to some extent these effects. So for example, I'd spend maybe 40 minutes collecting data and as part of this interview, hearing all about the daily challenges in the lives of the person who was speaking with me. And then towards the end, I would ask about personal sacrifices. And a lot of people couldn't think of any. Nothing came to mind, in spite of the fact that they had just been talking to me about all of the challenges they had faced. They'd forgotten that there had been a time where they could sleep through the night. where they could eat lunch at a normal time or take a break and go for a run or go for a walk or just enjoy their life in a more meaningful way. So I want to spend my last few minutes on strategies and solutions, first for law students and then for law faculty. In terms of conclusions, the COVID report reveals that our students have been struggling beyond really anything they have experienced collectively before. Many of us are eager to put the pandemic behind us, but the challenges that we faced have not subsided. The structural inequalities that had previously created these disparities based on race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and other markers exploded due to COVID in legal education, just as we've seen them explode in other realms in society. They will also stay with us long after COVID-19 recedes. So while it may be tempting to think of these challenges as these awful relics from the past, we really do instead have to dig deeper to dwell somewhat in the unpleasantness, to consider whether and how we might have failed our students so that we can learn to better support them going forward. Are food pantries enough? Can we rethink student debt? What's the best way to prioritize mental health so that we can encourage our law students in the ways that they need? So this opportunity to rethink legal education is long overdue. And what does it mean for us? How can we push ourselves further? I didn't want to end the annual report this year with trite suggestions for self-care. We have to do more than that. We cannot preach self-care if we are assigning work that takes all of our students' time. We cannot publish anti-racist resolutions without including specific action items for the short term as well as the long term. We can't claim to put students first, but then not attach the resources that students need to the support measures that we put in place. COVID has clearly left destruction in its path, but it's also forced us to innovate, to come up with opportunities to create whole symposiums like this online. And so how can we take what we have learned, that forced innovation, and think more creatively about ways in which we really can support students going forward? There are also strategies and solutions to consider for faculty. Many professors who can't afford it feel they are subsidizing their own work, paying for extra in-home help or fancy Ethernet cables. Others are fighting to get the accommodations they need, but contributing to further mental health stressors. Some fight and are denied, to be clear. One professor who said that all legal writing faculty were required to teach in person, even a medical documentation would not exempt her. A lot of faculty members did not feel supported institutionally. My survey data indicate that only 40% of professors felt supported by their institutions. Those who were offered immediate fixes like tenure extensions were concerned that that would not be enough, especially because some of their colleagues were able to delay their tenure by a year. They had no caregiving duties and were writing actually much more than usual. The actual solution was more simple than even I had expected, and that was really to pay attention, to understand what the needs were and be responsive to those needs. Ask faculty what they need. Some needed teaching relief, others wanted fewer service duties or more RAs. Lots of people needed equipment and were frustrated that they were expected to pay for a monitor or a desk or a whiteboard on their own, especially because they didn't have funding for travel because nobody was traveling. So really those who were the most satisfied are those who got the flexibility and the respect that they sought. So I'll end by noting that there are serious implications for these disparities. In my survey data, a full 43% of law professors indicate that they have considered leaving legal academia in the past year. This, to me, is a shocking statistic. More so when we recognize that vulnerable faculty, women of color, caregivers, untenured professors are more heavily represented in this group. What's the long-term trajectory for women who aren't able to publish for a year or two, whose voices are missing from our classrooms and from legal scholarship, if vulnerable populations don't have an opportunity to continue to participate, both in terms of their teaching and in terms of their scholarship? And if our most vulnerable students leave legal education, what does that mean for the future of our profession? So I look forward to working on these issues with you in the months and likely years to come. Thank you so much for your time and attention.